Great to be here. And Brendan, we've got a lot of ground to cover. So look, in being in this conference and many others, I think we can all agree the only thing constant in today's world is change. So with that, maybe just can you start with kicking us off with a quick overview of Thomson Reuters, kind of the business overall and the enterprise business, and a little bit more from the perspective of a buy-side customer.
Yeah, sure. So the enterprise business for Thomson Reuters is basically all of the content and services that we offer through feeds and APIs. And historically, we've actually referred to that as our feeds business. We've actually kind of rethought that a little bit. And if you were here earlier when you heard Deb Walton talking, Deb was talking about Electron Data Platform. So we actually think of it less as a feeds business, which implies we're just sending content out to you and you're consuming it, and really think about it more as a platform kind of a business. In terms of the relevance to the buy side, it's kind of interesting that we've seen a real transition. The feeds business started really in the sell side with large banks, whereas most of our traditional buy side customers took terminal-based products. And what we've seen over the last 5-10 years, and it was just touched on in the session previously, is really a shift away, driven by what's happening in the business, right? So the business is moving away from traditional, fundamental kind of stock picking to more passive strategies, but also more quantitative strategies in general. And so that's driving greater consumption of data and greater consumption of those data elements in applications. We're also seeing an increase in focus in risk and compliance kind of issues. And so that's feeding, and we're seeing our data is being fed not just into a traditional trading system or market data system, but it's also being fed into risk management kind of systems as well and compliance use cases. As I said, the business was originally called Feeds. We've actually kind of reconceptualized it, and we really think of it really now in three major elements. So at the core, of course, in everything that we do is content, right? So what's the actual content that we're providing? And we're really accelerating that in a couple of ways. One is, how do we actually accelerate the rate at which we onboard the kind of content that we have traditionally carried? And a lot of that is exchange or exchange-like kind of data. But we have seen an increased rate of change in that marketplace. And so we've actually made a pretty substantial investment in accelerating our ability to process that, but also diversifying the kind of content that we carry in the platform, whether that's ESG data, whether that's weather data, whether that's unstructured textual data. So that core content kind of piece is evolving. The second element of what we're doing is what we call integration. And we used to kind of use the term distribution, but it really is integration, because the concept of an open platform is that we can't be providing all the content that our customers need. You all need content not only from us, but from a variety of specialist kind of providers who have niche expertise in particular markets or segments of the markets. And so we're really developing, as part of our open platform strategy, the ability for you to integrate not only our content, but third-party content, or even content that you actually create yourself. And then finally, enrichment on top of that, because at the end of the day, people don't want just data. They want information, or they want answers, and we like to call ourselves the answer company. So how do you get to an answer? You have to actually take that content and you have to enrich it, whether that's with analytics or workflow. And so these days, that's being driven very heavily by a lot of regulatory change, but also by other changes in the industry. So we'll be talking shortly about MiFID. MiFID is obviously one of the big drivers for enrichment and is driving a lot of analytic kind of requirements. FRTB, the part of the Basel Capital Adequacy rules, is on the horizon, and we're looking at developing solutions around that as well. So that's kind of the 60,000-foot view of what we're doing.
Great, interesting. The key themes seem to constantly come up, right? Disruption, digitization, transformation, collaboration, people consuming data in all different ways. What are some of the key market trends that you really see driving this change?
So this is the number. So one of the biggest, obviously, is regulatory, right? Despite the Trump effect in the U.S., which is, as a country, and I'm speaking as an American, we have a very anti-regulatory regime in office right now. Despite that, I actually don't see any decrease in the rate of regulatory change. And so every firm, sell side and buy side, needs to be able to respond to that. And what's really happening ultimately with the regulation is it's a greater drive for transparency and information. So firms need to have good quality data. They need to have consistent data across risk, compliance, trading, and so forth. So they can't treat these things as silos anymore. They really need to be joined end to end. And they need to be able to extract information from that, really to provide the transparency to the regulators. Some of the other trends I think we just heard about in the last panel, which is the shift towards, and actually I think Tim Baker talked about it in his as well, a shift towards passive and quantitative investment. And so that's driving a couple of things. On the passive side, it's driving more focus on things like transaction cost analysis. Right? If you have a few basis points of slippage and you pick the right stock, who cares? On the other hand, if you're running a passive fund, that slippage is going to make a big impact in your performance, and it's going to be highly visible. So there's a lot more scrutiny on things like TCA, which has moved from being just a check-the-box kind of exercise to actually being really core if you're running a passive fund. On the flip side, you have a lot of asset managers who are looking for ways to outperform. How do you actually capture that alpha? And if you're just trading off and investing off the same information that everybody else has got, and you're not adding any secret sauce on top of that, then you're just going to be running with a pack, and because of fees and so forth, you're going to wind up underperforming the benchmark. So people are looking at alternative sources of data really to augment their strategies, or they're looking at additional kind of analytic kind of capability to extract more value out of the data that they've got.
Interesting. Interesting. So, no doubt that there's been a huge amount of change, right? And particularly with banking, trading, and financial services, the data-intensive businesses, if you will. But if we look back over the last few decades, technology's really been behind that, right? And the big one today that's on top of everyone's mind, right, is cloud. So when you think of cloud, give us your perspective on how are you looking at it, and how do you see cloud really changing things for the buy side?
Yeah, so I think cloud is going to be huge. And we've been doing a lot of outreach and having a lot of conversations with our customers over the last 2 years. And if I go back 2 years ago, I would say people were kind of interested in cloud. They were putting a toe in the water. Most of the banks and most of the buy sides were not doing anything with cloud, or at least they didn't know that they were doing anything. Within a lot of those firms, there was a quant or there was somebody who'd used their Amex card and spun up something on AWS to try something out. But it wasn't institutionalized. Now, if I look at it, I'd say 80% of the sell side and probably half of our buy side clients are committed to having at least some of their mission critical applications running in public cloud in the next, let's say, 2 to 3 years. So it is definitely pivoted.
And what do you think helped drive that pivot? Was it the volumes of data? Was it speed? Was it people found success? They found security? I mean, the one thing that we always hear about, right, is kind of how secure is my data if I put it in the cloud, right?
Yeah, so I think it's a combination of things. One is I think the technology has become more mature. Whether it's Amazon or Microsoft or Google or in China, Alibaba, they've all significantly matured their operations and their capabilities. Second, specifically with regard to things like security and compliance, they've actually proactively gone out and made sure that they have the right security certifications and so forth. And in the US, actually, FINRA, which is one of the key regulators, is actually going to be storing audit trail data on public cloud, on AWS. And so you have a major regulator storing highly sensitive data in AWS. And so you have other firms looking at that as an example, and they're saying, look, if you can store that kind of information, you can probably store mine. I was at a partners meeting with one of the top 10 global banks a few weeks ago, and they were talking about their strategy. And they are completely committed to moving to public cloud. And they actually quite deliberately said, including some of the most sensitive, personally identifiable information on their clients, both institutional and retail clients as well. Third, I think you've had success with cloud. So you've got the quant who's gone with their Amex card. They've spun up over the weekend and they've back tested on 20 years of data, some model they have built, and they've done it without waiting 6 months for IT to put a server in place. And they've gotten success with that. And so I think people are looking at that and saying, wow, that's actually very interesting. If you look at the drivers for cloud, I think the first thing that people go to is cost. And they say, this is a more cost-effective way, which I think in the long run is true. But for many firms, that's not going to be the compelling driver. It's really the agility and the ability to scale up very quickly. And then on top of that, what people are discovering is it's a software ecosystem. If you just think about it as virtual CPUs, memory, disk, and so forth that you can get on demand, then you're actually missing the big picture. The big picture is there's a wealth of software capabilities that Amazon, Microsoft, Alibaba, and so forth have invested in. If you look at Google, for example, they've invested a lot in machine learning, cognitive computing capabilities, And it's not just the horsepower, it's actually all the software intellectual property that they built for their core business that they're now leveraging and that you can leverage as well.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about man and the machine a little bit later, but before we go there, can you give us kind of the Thomson Reuters perspective on public cloud and really how you see that's impacted the business most directly?
Yeah, so we look at cloud through three lenses. So the first lens, and frankly probably the least interesting lens, is we're actually building stuff in the cloud. Now, you don't care about that because it's all behind the scenes, right? It's what happens behind the curtains. On the other hand, you probably should care because we actually have some really talented people who've learned a lot in the process of doing that, and we're actually bringing some of those people out to our customers and sharing some of our best practices. So we're happy to share what we've learned in the process of doing that. But we've actually, as of about a year ago, adopted a cloud-first strategy, which means any of the new systems or applications that we develop, we're building cloud native. So Deb referred earlier to Electron Data Platform and what we're doing to unify all of our non-real-time content delivery. That's being built entirely in public cloud. So that's the first. The second is we actually can act as a cloud provider for our customers. And we're actually providing more software and more services as a service. So instead of taking TREP, which is one of our software products, for example, as a deployed piece of software that you put on your own service, on your own site, we're actually providing that as a service. And then the third, and actually where we think the most interesting activity is how do we deliver to our customers as they adopt cloud? So as customers move their applications, whether it's risk management, portfolio management, whatever, into the public cloud, they're going to want to consume content and services, and they're going to want to consume them in a cloud-native fashion. So let me give you an example. Yeah. We have a tick history product, and we have 20 years of tick data on 400 exchanges around the world. It's massive. If you want, say, the entire history of tick data on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, we'll send that to you. We actually will ship a physical hard drive to you with a couple of terabytes of data on it. Well, as it happens, our next generation tick product was actually built on Amazon. And so later this year, one of the things that we're going to be doing is instead of us shipping you a hard drive, you go onto our GUI or you make an API request and you say, here's my Amazon S3 bucket, right, which is Amazon storage technology. Here's where I want the data, and we'll just drop it there, and then we'll tell you when it's there. So customers want to be able to consume that data native in cloud. They don't want to have us ship them a hard drive. They just want to be able to get the data in the cloud. And we're doing similar kind of things with our APIs to make them cloud native. So that's where we think actually the really exciting and interesting action is going to be, how do customers rewrite their applications or build new applications cloud native, and then how do we service them when they're in that environment?
And all of it all comes back to right data and how do you use data and how do you find the right patterns of information in that data to make it actionable, right? So you've mentioned a couple of things: Hadoop, cognitive computing,
yeah.
Internet of Things. Take us down that path for a minute.
So if you look at those things, so Internet of Things is fascinating for a couple of reasons. One is because it gives you new insight into what's happening. Fundamentally, actually, and I'll put this into a frame for our buy-side participants here today, fundamentally we're not doing things, or the industry's not doing things that are radically different than what we've always done. So if you look at Internet of Things, it's really just another way of doing something like channel checking, right? Historically, you've done things like channel checking to see what's actually happening in the distribution channel for a company's products or for a company's stores. Well, you did that by sending people out with clipboards and pens, and they could actually write down and make notes. Now you can actually get Internet of Things data to find out programmatically what's happening out in the physical world. But it's really analogous to something like channel checking. But what it does is it gets you much more real time. So Internet of Things data you can actually capture now as opposed to over weeks or months. And it's actually less subject to human error involved in it. And it's much more amenable to compute and processing and analytics. So things like Hadoop and some of the other big data technologies are basically used to analyze that kind of data. And what Internet of Things is doing is creating a massive exhaust of data. And that's actually one of the other reasons why things like cloud are important, because with traditional computing technologies, if you had to scale up to be able to handle that volume of data, it just gets very economically difficult to do that. Cloud actually makes that much more economically feasible.
Huge facilitator. Game changer, but
yeah.
Extraordinary facilitator. Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm just watching time, so if there's questions coming in, I want to pay attention to those. But let's talk about some of the other things that are going on in the market that would be of interest to the people in the room, right? So you've mentioned a couple of them, but there's a few other market dynamics that are really going on. Maybe we can talk about kind of the performance of hedge funds, the underperformance of hedge funds versus the indices. How is data really changing the views on there?
Yeah, so again, if you look at as an asset class, hedge funds have underperformed the index. So what that means is, if you're in that category, you're looking for some way that you can outperform that index. And again, if you're looking at the same data that everybody else is looking, you're applying the same techniques to it, at best, you're going to be also ran in that, right? So you've got to find alternative sources of data, or you've got to find more ways to actually extract intelligent information out of that. So that's where we see people making use of the data. I will talk, there was a question earlier about IBM Watson and cognitive computing. Going back to sort of the data question, it actually really is all about the data. We've done some projects where we actually tried to, let's call it effectively search, and extract information from a large corpus of data. And what we found is applying that kind of AI or cognitive computing actually gave a boost to both what we call the recall and the precision. Recall is how much of what you're looking for did you find, and precision is how precise was it as opposed to how noisy was it. And what we found is actually about 2/3 of the gain that we got was from things like what Tim Baker was referring to, which is putting the graph in place and the perm ID and the data model. So it really actually is about the quality of the data, how you join those data elements together. And that actually generates about 2/3 of the information value that you get from that. And then the cognitive computing kind of gives you another level on top of that. But the foundation of it absolutely has to be the data and the data model and how you link that all up.
It's pretty phenomenal when you listen to all of the technology and all of the changes and the applications and how that's facilitating business and the role of the regulator. But I think in the final minutes, I just really want to get your thoughts, and especially if any of you in the audience are fans of Flash Boys like I am, you made a pretty great statement in that book, which was really about figuring out what was it worth to do the famous line between Chicago and New York, right? What was that worth? And you said, look, anybody can put their finger in there and kind of put a price on it. But give us your views in closing, kind of where does this all go? Where do we all have a role in this? Are we eventually all going to be replaced by machine, or do we still have an important place to be in the wheel?
Yeah, it's a really great question. And as the father of 2 young men who are in university and coming out, it's one of the things actually that I grapple with. And for anyone who's in a similar situation, you sort of look at what their professions are going to be over the next 20, 30 years. If you're doing something that is a very mechanical kind of a process, right? If you're not actually adding any value or any insight into it, yeah, a lot of those processes are going to be replaced by machines. Machines are basically tools, right? And they amplified humans' capability physically for years, and now they're amplifying our mental capability. I don't think that the human element goes away to it. Humans still have to construct the strategy. They have to guide the machines. They have to actually create the body of knowledge, that goes into the machine and tell it what's relevant and what's not relevant. Big data technologies can do a lot of analysis and extract things, but there's actually a friend of mine who's a professor at Berkeley, David Lineweber, who wrote a classic paper called Spurious Correlations. And what he did is he used, this is actually going back 20 years ago, but he did a correlation analysis, and what he determined is that you could predict, I forget the numbers, but let's say 95% performance of the Dow Industrial Average over a 20-year period by correlation with butter production in Bangladesh plus a couple of other factors. And it turns out if you back tested it, it fit absolutely perfect. There was no causality whatsoever in it, but the machine could actually find the correlation.
Patterns.
And basically, correlation is not causation, right? So machines are really good for finding patterns, but humans have to actually step back and say, wait a second, butter production in Bangladesh has nothing to do with the performance of the Dow, and that is a spurious, as far as we know. And that is purely a spurious correlation. And so let's not actually use that as the basis for an investment strategy, right? So you still need that human intelligence layer on top of the machine recognition.
Fantastic. Great. We have had a couple of questions come in, and I'm conscious of time. So look, there's an interesting one here that says, is the risk appetite of firms in the West driving adoption of new technologies, such as cloud, reflective of regional differences in adoption when it's compared to Asia? If so, what are the key drivers for adoption of new tech? anything that you see?
I don't see any less of an appetite in Asia for adoption of cloud, actually. What I see is that the major cloud providers, and I mentioned, we see it as really Microsoft, Google, and Amazon, and then again in China, Alibaba, because they started in the West and because they built out their data centers there and so forth first, and because frankly, things like latency matter, right? And I think coming from an American perspective, you don't appreciate sometimes the great distances between cities in Asia. Having data centers actually in country matters for things like cloud. We think of it as this conceptual fluffy cloud thing, but it physically winds up being data centers and cables. So I think the capabilities have come here a little bit after they've come to the US, not by much, but I don't see any less appetite. And I've talked to some customers just while I've been here this week, and there's a very strong appetite. I understand Amazon actually had their conference about 3-4 weeks ago here and was amazingly well attended. So I don't think the risk appetite is any different there.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, I see that we are running out of time. Thanks for the note on the data centers in closing, because that's music to my ears, of course, in our business. So, Brennan, it's been a real pleasure.
Thank you,
if there's
Mary.
additional questions from the audience, I think you're going to be around.
I'll be around.
Yes? Okay.
Thank you very much, Mary.
Thank you.
Thank you.